Hello and welcome. Today we have Dr. Amy Cox-Peterson, and she is going to share some information regarding decomposition chemistry and remote instruction. So thank you, Dr. Cox-Peterson.
Oh, thank you, Cynthia. And it's great to be back with everyone. I know we have some of the same people on today, which is awesome. I focus the last couple of webinars on the earlier grades, K through 2, and then 3 through 5 to 6. And then today is more 6 through 8. Again, like I said before, many of these can be adapted either up to high school or down to elementary grades, depending on the standards. And so you would get more sophisticated in scientific concepts as you go up further. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about today. You'll notice if you've joined me before, I will begin in a similar way with inquiry and NGSS, National Next Generation Science Standards. And then we'll move on to some sample ideas and activities for students online and working remotely with them. So here we go today. Now this is our agenda. And as I indicated, this is what we're going to be doing. I am going to touch on the nature of science today. Nature of science is very important in the early grades, but becomes more, probably more aligned with the different standards as students move into higher grades. I'm going to introduce a group investigation model that works really well with online and remote teaching, and then some sample activities, and of course the science take-home kit. So to begin, you may have seen this before. I'll review it again. Teaching online or teaching remotely. My view is there are 4 really important things to remember, and the first is communication with students and families on expectations, materials needed. Connecting often. I have heard from so many different families, kids in multiple grade levels, and they tend to like the remote versus the posting an activity and the students turn it in, and posting an activity. The connection's really important. And students can share different things, share their investigations. It doesn't have to be a teacher talking and lecturing all the time. It can be a sharing session. And maybe those lectures are something that you record and students could watch again. The reason why I like recorded lectures is because students can go forward or backward and listen to things over and over again. And then another thing that I've been advocating for are the long-term investigations, not the ones that are quick, here you go, but the long-term investigations that build on multiple scientific skills, scientific concepts, and they take place over time. And I'll show you some today that work in multiple science disciplines as well. And the final one, of course, is that consistent input, the consistent clarifying of concepts. Teachers asking questions, but more importantly, students asking questions as well. And then these are the science inquiry practices. And I think I indicated in my last webinar that these are also in a book that I co-wrote with some of my colleagues, Dr. Terry Patchen and Dr. Leah Melber, so you can find these there. And just these are basic, but can be used over and over again. The observation is key to most science activities and investigations. Again, multiple questions, multiple sources, and tools, predictions, and communication, all very important. The science process skills, the top ones, as we've discussed before, are the more basic, but very important to have students utilize. And then these below are a little more, they are more sophisticated as they gain more knowledge and skills. And so I think as you get into middle school, experimenting can take place in most experiments or in most activities that are done, and students can do these at home. The inference is going to be very big here, because as students collect information, or if they are observing, you would want them to take that information and make leaps into inferences, and that's what scientists do. And as all scientists, you will know, usually scientists in our world today, they could be in labs, they could be outside collecting data, but they all take their data, they organize it in some way, they analyze it, and they communicate it. They communicate it in a science journal article. They may communicate it at a science conference. And so what you can do is emulate this with your own students and have them be part of the scientific process and showing their investigations and their findings. And so that's really a cool thing. You could have that if you have 9 weeks. I don't know how your schools are divided. Some are divided into 4 9-week sessions, and 18 weeks being the first semester and another 18 the second semester. You could plan to have scientific conferences at the end of every 9 weeks. I think that would work. You could have students choose their own topic based on certain standards. You could give them topics and give them still some decision making there. But I think it would be one of the best things you can do with your kids is to have them go through the scientific process, and communicating is an important part of that. And so, which leads to the next generation science standards. If you want to go back and view these again, most states have adopted the standards. California has as well. There are 3 important components that relate to the practices of what scientists actually do, the content of the science and those concepts, and then these cross-cutting, large, overarching categories that move in and out of disciplines. These are a few from the grade 6 and 7 in California. So I just pulled up the California, and you'll see they, a lot of integrated science takes place in grade 6 through 8. These happen to be chemical processes. And if you notice, it talks with chemical reactions, but also within plants. So it's chemistry and biology and integration, their cellular respiration and so forth, but it all relates to chemistry and biology. When you look at cells and the structure of cells and so forth, you'll see that there's a lot there that's integrated within the science disciplines. And that leads me to the nature of science. And so for students to be a part of science, it's important that they understand the nature of science. And the nature of science is everywhere. You will see different parts of this. This happens to be from the NSTA, the National Science Teachers Association position statement. So this is one that's used by many. I would encourage you to have your students know the nature of science and to discuss it as they move into learning about concepts and creating their own activities and investigations. And the first thing is there is no one scientific method. This is a big one because a lot of times in science class, here's the scientific method. I know some scientists, when you ask them, what's the scientific method? They actually go back to their 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th science classes, and they recite it from there. They're not even thinking about what they actually do in their jobs because they're thinking the scientific method is the one they learned. It doesn't necessarily translate to what scientists actually do because it's a more cyclical process. Yes, there are components that are very important in scientific methods, but sometimes they move back and forth within the different parts of it, because you may ask a question and you may create an experiment and you collect data, but then you have more questions and then you have different data. You may gain information from findings and then ask even more questions. And so it's really more cyclical, and you want students to know this. And so just having that form, this is the scientific method. And also that scientific method is not just following somebody else's procedure as well. So you want them to create their own. These are 2 big ones that I'm going to go into a little bit because students should understand the difference between theories and laws. Theories are the big umbrella. It's kind of like almost those similar to the cross-cutting concepts because they move, it's a big umbrella, but they are, they explain the phenomena. They explain things. So they're based on laws and facts and a whole bunch of scientific ideas. And then laws don't turn into theories. They're very different. They actually are very tested, observable statements over and over again. And students should understand the difference between these as they move into higher level understanding of science. Some other really important things, these things right here. Science is embedded in culture and society. So we decide what kind of science can be done. Many nations around the world say, yes, they give the okay for this to be done and that cannot be done. It is biased. It has to be somewhat because the humans are the ones creating these scientific investigations. And so it cannot help but to be somewhat biased. It's also biased by the information we know already and what we believe we should know. So these two things are important to know and for students to understand. Another thing is science is tentative. What we know now may not be what we know in 10 years or in 2 weeks. It's forever changing because of the new knowledge that continues to be developed and continues to be uncovered. It is extremely creative. Scientists really, if they go through this creative endeavor to determine how they're going to collect information for new scientific findings and to add to the scientific literature. It's everywhere. It really is. I don't know. It's most everywhere you can look. You could probably figure out some way that science is involved. Maybe even challenge your students. What is not science? That's interesting too. What science is, what it is not. And then what are examples of science and examples of what it is not. I'm sure you could find that, but just showing that how much science is a part of our lives would be important. And I just want to give you a little idea of these laws and theories because I think they're confused a lot definitely with students, but sometimes with teachers as well. And as I discussed earlier, it is a unifying concept that can be tested. It's a statement or generalization. And we know this by testing something over and over and over again. Over again, we get the same result over and over and over. Now, some laws have been revised over time, and you'll see how that goes. But once it gets the same result and observed regularities, they are created. And sometimes they're mathematical statements. So these are examples that you know. I'm sure everyone knows about Newton's laws of motion. He tested these. Now we know them. Now we talk about them. We teach them over and over again. These are some others. Kepler's law of planetary motion, as you know, the king and buoyancy you probably heard of many years ago, who got in the bathtub and noticed the water level in different ways. So, work with these within your students. And instead of just saying, what's the law of motion? What's Newton's laws of motion? How did they come about? How did they relate to the nature of science? Why are they a law? Oh, because it happens over and over and over again. The law of planetary motion. We can observe some of that over and over and over again. And others as well. And then we move into theories, and we call this the grand set. This is a synthesis of integrated information. It is a body of knowledge, huge, big body of knowledge to help us understand science. And they're general principles. So it's all of these things together, all these ideas and statements that can be substantiated by evidence. It doesn't mean it's a theory like we don't know. It's a theory we do know based on all this information and evidence. And these are some ones such as the Big Bang Theory, evolution and natural selection, huge, big ideas related to science. Cell theory, I think we all know. And what's interesting? I don't know that I ever really learned about germ theory that often. I wonder if it's going to be included in more textbooks now that we have COVID-19. Germ theory. maybe more important than it has been in other years. There are many resources online. This is one I kind of like. This is from a How Stuff Works article, and it just talks about scientific laws and theories that everyone should know. I think it gives a top 10. There are probably a lot more, but that's just a starting point. Okay, so laws, theories, scientific investigations, processes, and so forth. And I said I would look at, I actually labeled this chemistry, but it's more of an integration of chemistry. And so this is one of my favorites. This is called the Wingradsky column, named after the person, Wingradsky, who, gosh, I don't even know how many years ago, so many years, I should know. We can look that up, but many, many, many. Created microbiology in a bottle. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute. But this is a biogeochemical cycle. So it includes biology, geology, and chemistry all together. So I'm going to go back here, and this is how you set it up. This is a link. This is from Scientific American. You can find this column almost anywhere, and you can do it in a variety of ways. But this is the way you set it up typically, and you add different components within this column. And so this happens to be pond soil. So you could get beach soil, pond soil, and you create this ecosystem within a bottle. And so if you look here, this is the way it's set up. And you can put things, as sulfur and carbon sources. This happens to be newspaper as a carbon source. And some people use eggs and some other things. You can actually perform an experiment, have multiple columns and look at the differences. You could have different soils. So just look online. They're everywhere, and you can find it. This is what happens. This happened to be over an 8-week time period. And if you look, so we had to add Arm & Hammer. It was stinking so bad. My daughter and I just did this over quarantine over the last couple months. And she actually was doing this as one of her projects. And so this layer wasn't quite on there, but it's a biofilm layer that you can read more about. And we had to put Arm & Hammer little things because it was stinking. And we put it by a north-facing window. And then this here is after this is after a couple of weeks, a few more. And then you see you cover it. You cover it there with plastic so you can observe it. Some of the plastic was removed for some of these types of photos so that you can get a better idea, and there it is. But as you can see, and as the film, it got more dense, and air bubble and bubbles were forming. And then also within her column, you could see the different colors, but it was such dark soil to begin with, you didn't see. But in some other soils, you're going to be able to see different layers and different colors as you move. And so what happens is these naturally occurring microbes establish these geochemical gradients inside the column. And so there is so much science in a bottle here. Students can do this at home. You could, when we look at science kits, you could actually start collecting these bottles and put them in the science kit. I'll show you the one that we use right here. It actually is a Kirkland bottle. It's one of the larger water bottles. And so if you bought a couple of cases, drink the water through. I know it's not ecologically very friendly, but if it's in the name of science, maybe you could use the water and then use the bottles, put that in a kit. Students can collect soil from multiple areas. And there is so much biology, some geology, but also chemistry in the process. So that's really one of the coolest things. And they can do it over time, again, long term. And I think what's neat too is they could do it once and then they do it again. So maybe they do it once with one column, but then they set up their own experiment. And so they could have different soils or different types of carbon or sulfur, changing the variables in some way. And then some other decomposition activities. This is one I talked about in another webinar, but you would go into much more detail related to the chemical and biological processes that are going on within decomposition. So I'll come back to this slide in a moment. I just wanted to show you, this is a before and after, and this only is for 5 days. I'm recommending you do it with your students for at least 2 to 4 weeks, but you would want to bury certain foods and then investigate these things. And I think this is part of the avocado peel, which was here and here. And this is a part of a Cheeto, which is here and here and there. So as you look at this, so again, you would want to go much more in depth. I would encourage the students to bury different things. Burying meat, I don't have in my examples, but it's really interesting the way that decomposes. Vegetables and candy, and maybe some candy looks exactly the same when you pull it out of the ground. You want students to document these items. You want them to act as if they are performing a scientific investigation. So they will also need to determine a spot for the burial. They will need to create a map with the different north, south, east, west, the different measurements that, maybe from a certain landmark of the location, and how deep are you burying it, to make sure you have some type of tape measure or a ruler, and you want it to be very specific. Unearth the items, I'd say about 4 weeks is right. Observe them closely. I like to use a cell phone microscope, as many of you know. Photograph, look for microorganisms. They may need to also investigate using variety of resources of why certain things decompose at different times and in different processes, what type of microorganisms are growing on the different food that was buried. And so you, again, a very long-term investigation that could go on throughout the school year. You could do this again every 9 weeks and look at different biological or chemical processes that are taking place. And that's what I have here. Just conduct additional investigations. And this is the microscope. If you're not familiar with it, it fits on a cell phone, and I'll show you, I have another slide on that. And then another, these happen to be online. These are not mine, but my students have done this before, my kids have done this before, and I know they love it. And this is fabulous at home because typically they can use whatever they have in their cabinet. So when you look at cells are a big part of the middle school curriculum. And of course, cells, relate again to biology and chemistry, or biochemistry. And so this happens to be a plant cell. And this may be Jell-O, I think, and they used a variety of things, and they labeled the cell wall and so many other things here. This is another cake. And you can see all the candies, and this is an animal cell, I'm pretty sure. And you could do it as a pizza, and you have your different toppings. You could have it as, this is a sandwich. So there's so many different ways that you can show it. And use food, use what your kids have. So trying to use these things at home when you're teaching remotely is really a valuable resource. And then this is the cell phone microscope. We've all, those of you who have been on before, it's one of my favorites. When I tried to take photos of the column and the biofilm, you actually have to get a little closer than I could get. It wasn't photographing it that well. So it does work better if you actually have it right on top of the object that you're trying to look closer into. And so that leads into, those are just some of my favorite activities. You can look for a variety of things that will work at home and when you're teaching online and remotely. But I think this particular teaching model will work well. And you can follow these steps. And they are not done in one day, obviously. They are done over time. And so one of the ways when you're working with your students, you give them some type of puzzlement. And this is a tried and true. This is not mine. This has been around for ages on a group investigation model. And you start with some kind of puzzlement or something that challenges their brain to something happens that they didn't expect, or it's something that's really gross, or it's something that provokes their interest in some way. And it can be a video or a photo, and then it has students asking questions. So they're going to pose the questions, organize their questions, and then maybe divide up into groups. It doesn't mean that, you know, it might be that they all want 5 students want to answer this question and 3 students want to ask a different question. Maybe 1 student wants to ask a question on their own. That's fine. You know, have fluid groups, have flexible groups, and then they can pull their information together. They locate answers to questions. They can look online, but also you could encourage them to create some activities or experimentation at their own homes. Teacher will facilitate, students can check in, maybe there's some troubleshooting, maybe they have to rework some things. And then, as I was talking about earlier, have a conference. Present their findings at this conference. They have a question, this is what they found. It can be a combination of sources online. It could be some within their textbook, and it could be what they've actually experimented with on their own. The group evaluation and recycling, this is important as well, because now after these presentations and the scientific conference, this often happens, scientists have additional questions. So then you want to extend knowledge and move beyond what they found into deeper understanding. So the group investigation model should work really well, and you could do this over and over again with lots of different phenomena. Another one of my favorites, as many of you know, is to connect science with literacy. These are some ways in the middle school level I think would work really well. Using descriptive words, using exact as possible, measurement-based words. So you wouldn't want to say small, or you wouldn't want to say large. You wanted to use tools to actually measure. You can weigh them. You can, if it's, you know, if it's a liquid, you can look at the volume. If you're measuring the length of something, and then you introduce the scientific words within these experiences. So you can cover some vocabulary early on, but most of that vocabulary is going to develop naturally on its own. And then the teacher, as a facilitator, will go back through and clarify these words, these concepts, any misconceptions about them. Important for cause and effect. This is an important literacy skill, but it's also an important science skill to look how one thing affects another. The also lovable KWL charts are really important. They can be used at all levels, really, really good at the middle school level as well. Maybe teachers want to have some interest surveys and questionnaires to their students. What are you most interested in? And then look at the standards and relate to it. Also give them opportunities to have choices and what they'd like to investigate. Everyone doesn't have to investigate the exact same thing, particularly if there's learning at home, then you could do it with a variety of different materials as well. The independent reading and reporting, supply a variety of links online that you know are reputable sources. Also encourage your students to look for reputable sources online. And as we know, there are things that are available that may not be scientifically correct or from a source that we would want to rely on. Always important, you could put concepts and information in songs and music, and encourage that with your students. And again, going back to the scientific conferences to present their findings. I encourage alternate and authentic assessment in middle grades. It becomes really, I don't know, as a practice to test, multiple choice, probably if it's online, test. Well, test is, there's a reason to have some tests. When kids get into college, they're going to be tests. When they get into high school, they're going to be tests. So I'm not going to say that we shouldn't have them, but I will say to try to find alternative and authentic assessments, because if you're providing lots of experimentation and writing and reading and scientific conference presenting, then you would want to assess them in that way as well. So if you could just have maybe a combination of the looking and understanding concepts in a written exam, but also, or quizzes, and also this alternative way. So when they are performing or creating something, you can assess that. You can assess their higher level critical thinking and problem solving. Anytime they are engaging in tasks, and as they are investigating real world applications. So this is pretty general, but just to remind you to think of the other ways to assess their science understanding and their science knowledge. Utilizing and partnering with community resources. This happens to be a photo from the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach. Even if the kids can't visit, there is an array of information and resources for teachers, and students can look at this information as well. There's a lot all over the world that you can access, but also within your own community. I live in San Juan Capistrano, and there are 3 wonderful resources within the community, and they have a lot of information online as well. There's an ecology center, the Historic Mission, and Tree of Life Nursery that has a lot of native California plants. So encourage this community resource partnerships and resources, and they are reputable places that students can find information to help with their gathering of resources and finding answers to their questions. And finally, the take-home science kit, one of my favorites. This is a photo of ones I think that are, you can put whatever you want in your kit. These are some things for middle grades. Of course, goggles they may need, particularly if they are working with chemicals or anything that could be harmful to their eyes. This is just, you can buy these trays. They're pretty inexpensive. And this is an eyedropper. This is actual eyedropper. You can find these online, usually a pH strip here with the strip and then the colors to figure out which color certain chemicals might be and where they rate on the scale. This is the cell phone microscope that you put on your cell phone, and it attaches. I like to include colored pencils. Markers, yes, as well, but I love the colored pencils. This is a measuring tape, food coloring. These are some graduated cylinders and beakers. You can see, this is actually a scale. You can buy these, and they're pretty inexpensive, and students can weigh things. This is a hand lens, and you might want to, provide scissors and glue and some other things. And then finally, in conclusion, I would just encourage the nature of science and NGSS to guide the content and the inquiry of students. Focus on the long-term investigations over time that they can do at home. Use this the most inexpensive materials as possible, but particularly those that they use many times. And I think that that will be better bang for your buck if you decide to have a kit that students will take home. It might be that you give them a kit in September if they're going to have some online sessions at their home or remote sessions, and then maybe in January have a different kit based on the activities you decide to do. Integrating other subjects is always a good idea, using a variety of reputable reference materials and community resources. And then obviously encouraging students to share during your Zoom session. So it doesn't have to be the teacher talking all the time. Let the students talk. And I believe that is all I have. So thank you very much for being a part of this webinar, and those of you who are a part of the other 2 webinars as well.